broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, thank you guys, and welcome to another of EBFA's webinar series. We have a great webinar for you tonight with Kevin Moore all the way from Hong Kong. It's going to be a very exciting webinar that I know you guys are going to gain some great, insightful information. If this is your first webinar that you are tuning in on, please know that all the webinars are recorded and archived. They are kept on the EBFA website. So just in case you didn't catch anything that Kevin says or any of the questions, know that you can always reference back at them. If you want a copy of the presentation, the actual slideshow, please email me at education@ebfafitness.com and we'll send you that copy so you can go through it or review it with some of the trainers. And then at the end, we're going to do some Q&A. So if you have some questions for Kevin at the end of this webinar, then feel free to type them in and we will do that at the end. So with no further hesitation, I want to welcome Kevin Moore, who is a Pilates instructor and fitness educator in Hong Kong. And he is someone who I met back in July when I was doing my barefoot program and bringing it to Asia. And he impressed me immediately as soon as I met him. And the way that he looked at movement and assessed movement and used a lot of his unique background to do corrective exercise programming, I knew that he would be a perfect educator to bring on for the webinar series. So welcome, Kevin. Thank you so much for coming and joining us on our EBFA webinars.
It's my pleasure, Emily. Thank you very much for having me.
You're so welcome. Go ahead, Kevin. I want to give the floor to you. Go through it, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, so we're going to spend some time today talking about the glutes. But before we get too much into the details, I want to give everybody a sense of exactly what I do and how I've come to some of the conclusions that I've come to. So yeah, as Emily said, my original certification's in Pilates, and so I do work with people in kind of a fitness capacity. But what I've found is that over time, I get basically two types of people coming to me. And one type is a person who is experiencing chronic pain, and that could be pain of a very mild nature, or it could be quite acute. And that chronic pain is associated with some kind of a mechanical difficulty, you know, some kind of unsustainable movement pattern. And so, starting with Pilates as a base, but also many other things now in my career, I try to identify that pattern and rebuild it to get rid of the pain. The other thing that I see a lot of is people with sports-specific requirements, golfers, tennis players, runners, etc., who through mechanics are trying to improve their sports performance. And again, the concept is the same, that there's some kind of a movement pattern, a movement sequence that could be more efficient or could be better balanced, and that's kind of my job, is to identify that pattern and then through kind of as simple and direct movements as possible, rebuild a more efficient pattern. And so certain things have jumped out at me over the last few years as being kind of central points to creating good movement patterns, and the glutes are a really effective kind of highway point where you can focus in on the glute and lots of dysfunctions land there. Dysfunctions in the foot often can translate into hip and glute dysfunction. Dysfunctions like scoliosis, leg length difference, that can have a direct impact on hip and glute function. And glute function is a great place to start and work out. You know, once the glute's not working properly, it's really difficult to get anything else to work properly. So let's jump ahead to the next slide here. I want you to see exactly kind of who we're talking about. And what you're going to see, so where's that next slide? Hey, Emily, we can jump ahead to the next slide?
Yeah, I'm on the origins and insertions.
Oh, interesting, I can't see it. Okay, that's fine. So origins and insertions. But we're talking about the glute max. Glute minimus, glute medius, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the thing I want you to see about the glute max, first of all, is it's strongly lateral. And we get used to thinking of the glute max as a hip extensor. And it's true, it's a hip extensor. But we are a bipedal creature, which means that at any given time, we need to be able to function with one foot on the ground, and that one foot needs to be able to stabilize the rest of the body. And so the glute is really good at acting unilaterally with a one point contact and stabilizing the rest of the body. Also, the other thing that's going to become important later is if you take a look at where where it originates up the spine, it in fact does interact with the sacroiliac joint and acts as an extensor of the sacroiliac joint, or more importantly, as an eccentric extensor of the sacroiliac joint. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later, but just kind of keep that in mind as we go on. And so one of the things that I use to really kind of demonstrate the importance of the glute is a bit of comparative anatomy. So if we jump ahead to the next slide, what you'll see is a chart here. And what this chart shows is the glute mass as a percentage of overall hip mass for three creatures: the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the human. And as you can see, when we hit human, we jumped up quite a bit for a percentage of glute mass. And it was theorized for a little while that that was mostly having to do with upright posture, right? That the glute max was active or was present to keep us standing upright or walking bipedally. And actually, there's a study I'm going to be referencing here shortly, done out of Harvard and then presented in the Journal of Experimental Biology, that kind of shows that the glute max wasn't so important for, or isn't so important for walking and standing, but some other functions that we'll talk about in a moment. But the thing I want you to see here is this big jump in hip mass, and this shows there's got to be something else going on. And to give you a better idea of what that number really looks like, you know, take a look here at the next slide. You'll see a lowland gorilla who really has about the flattest butt you ever saw. If you saw a human with that butt, you'd probably make fun of them. But if you jump ahead to the next slide after that, boom, that's a butt that gets used pretty often, right? And again, we're talking about second that one of the evolutionary functions of the glute is to serve as a running muscle. And here's somebody who does a whole lot of running, and you can see that, you know, going from 13.3 at the gorilla to 18.3 in the human, that's a big difference. An even bigger difference is the next slide. And that's not really fair to the gorilla. I know that's cheating a little bit. But anyway, I just want you to have a sense of what 18.3% glute mass really comes out to. It's quite a bit. It's quite noticeable. So let's talk about exactly what the glute max is for then. If it's not for standing and it's not for walking, if we jump to the next slide, what we're going to see is that it's actually for stabilizing the trunk during running. Because running has two things that set it apart from walking that are really important. First of all, increased flexion. You spend more time in flexion when you run than when you walk, about 10 degrees more typically. And that increased flexion requires an increased eccentric control coming from your extensors, in particular your lateral extensors. Because the running gait also, in addition to extra flexion, also has kind of a longer aerial cycle. You spend more time on one point and then even sometimes on no points, right? So that lateral stability becomes really, really important, and you need more than just your deep lateral rotators, the deep six lateral rotators, to create that stability. The glute max provides that extra oomph to your lateral stability. The other thing that running has is a strong increase in ground forces, ground impact forces. When you heel strike during a dead run, you can get up to 4 times your body weight in ground force impact. And because you are in 10 degrees of on average 10 degrees of flexion greater when you run, and because hip flexion and knee flexion tend to create, and ankle flexion tend to create internal rotation, those increased ground forces can cause collapse in both the medial and flexion directions. Well, lo and behold, here's the glute max, which is an incredibly strong muscle and perfectly well designed to do exactly the opposite, to do lateral rotation and extension. So as an eccentric controller, it's a really, really powerful muscle, and without it, you do see that people collapse, either in the medial or flexion direction. And there's a ton of postural deviations that I work with on a daily basis that are directly related to those collapses, that lack of stability in those directions. So these three quotes that you're looking at right now, I've pulled directly from this study from Journal of Experimental Biology, and I'll give you the reference for that later if you'd like to look into the study yourself. Yeah, very, very interesting information. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to be, excuse me, we're going to be taking apart the glute itself now and comparing it to some of the other muscles that it works in conjunction with. And the first thing I want to show you here in this slide is that how closely it follows the pattern of the lateral rotators beneath it. That while standing and walking can do just fine with those deep six, when we do increase ground forces, we do increase flexion, we gotta have something bigger. And that bigger force comes from that layer on top. The other thing I want you to notice, especially for those of you listening who are involved in healthcare or pain management, either in medicine or fitness or whatever, you've no doubt come across a piriformis injury at some point in your career. Piriformis is one of those muscles that notoriously is over-recruited and super, super tight, especially in athletes. And I've hypothesized here that the piriformis overacts when it doesn't get the stability from the glute that it needs. So when you are in that deep flexion, and again, athletes are there all the time, but when you are in that deep hip flexion or spinal flexion, and the glute max is weakened or inhibited, piriformis ends up having to do a whole lot more work, and it's a tiny muscle. It's not really designed to do that. And we'll get a little more to glute medius as well a little bit later, but now if we take a look at the next slide and we compare that glute max to its counterpart on the anterior side, we are seeing a lot of internally rotating forces here. And I have an exercise that I like to do, a very simple exercise, which is both diagnostic in terms of checking if people are doing or are getting the eccentric control they need from their glute, but also it can be restorative. It's something I have people do a lot as a warm-up in preparation for stronger exercises. So let's jump ahead to that video, and I show if the video is working. Let's see, I can't see it on my screen, but Emily, what do you think? Can we see that video?
Yep, and it's playing.
It's fantastic. All right, so here we have, it's a simple weight shift, right, from foot to foot. And what I'm getting as I lunge forward is a few degrees of knee flexion, a few degrees of hip flexion, and then just a little bit of spinal flexion is often what I'll have people do as well. And that forward foot, that my right glute right now, should be acting eccentrically almost immediately as soon as I start moving forward. And if it doesn't, what you'll see is that the pelvis will rotate to the right, and the knee will often collapse immediately. And so it's a really simple motion. You do it with both legs right off the bat. In a couple of seconds, you can tell if there's a balanced movement pattern there or not. So I have people do this all the time. I mean, even up into very, very strong athletes, because it's not about kind of how generally strong they are. It's how balanced their patterns are. So if you're there at home listening and you have a space, I want you to get up and try that lunge a couple times. And I want you to see if you can feel the eccentric pullback coming from the front leg, the front glute, as you pass forward. Anyway, it's an interesting thing to check yourself on. So if we jump ahead to the next comparison, I mentioned before the strongly lateral component of the glute. And I want to contrast that against a lot of the more kind of linear muscles that stabilize the trunk and the hip. So we've got, of course, the hamstrings, biceps femoris on the leg, and then here at the back, we've got all of the deep back extensors. And the one I really want to draw your attention to is the quadratus lumborum. Now, quadratus lumborum does have a slight kind of lateral angle, but it acts linearly, or at least when it acts bilaterally, typically in a linear way. But what I see frequently is when we have glute dysfunction, or glute inhibition, or glute weakness, the QL on the same side ends up being over-recruited, right? The body can't get the eccentric control and flexion from below the hip, so it's got to jump up above the hip and grab it. The other thing you'll notice is that the striation pattern on the QL, however, it's a little bit lateral, and it's lateral in the same direction as the glute. So what you'll see with the deficient glute is QL dysfunction on the same side, right, just above the same joint. And then, of course, the hamstrings. I mean, again, if you work at all in pain management or in fitness or in medicine, you see people with tight hamstrings, dysfunctional hamstrings all the time. Matter of fact, I don't know that many people I've ever worked with that have what I would call functional hamstrings, myself included. It's a muscle that gets over-recruited all the time. And hamstring tightness, what I have come to find out, is really less a function of it needing to be stretched and more a function of it needing to be encouraged to turn off when it comes to stabilization of hip flexion. It needs that glute to act as a extensor, a lateral extensor, to be able to turn off during flexion. So then compare that to the next slide, please. Compare that to the more surface back muscles. Here we have a lot of lateral action going on here, and the thing that I really want to draw your attention to on this slide is latissimus dorsi. The lat is angular. It's a lateral muscle, right? And what I find when we have glute dysfunction, let's say on the right side, as I said before, we're going to have QL dysfunction on the same side. It's going to be over-recruited. And then we're going to have latissimus dorsi dysfunction on the opposite side. Again, follow the striation pattern, right? Your body can't get something from somewhere. It's going to grab it where it can. In this case, because it's above the joint, it needs a little bit more. It grabs it from two locations, one on each side, to create what that one glute muscle could do by itself. And the thing that you want to look out for here, if you're working with people, in particular athletes on this one, is that when that lat is over-recruited, remember, the lat is an internal rotator of the humerus. So if you've got an over-recruited lat, and you've got somebody who you need to be able to have externally rotate, golfers are a perfect example. They're not going to get it. They're not going to get the external rotation they need in the shoulder if their lat is constantly clamping down to create hip stability, right? We've got to let that lat be a back muscle, be a shoulder stabilizer, be a shoulder mobilizer, and let it stop being a hip stabilizer. Does that make sense? You know, we have to let the glute be the glute and the lat be the lat. But it's an interesting pattern, and take a look for that in some of the athletes that you're working with. Now, I have another exercise here I want to show you, and this gets into a little bit of what we expect from our back muscles. As I'm doing flexion in my lunge position, my front leg glute, my standing leg glute, should be doing quite a bit of stability. And if it's not, and actually, Emily, do you have the opportunity to play that video again? Can you repeat that video? Okay. I want people to see it a couple of times. Because as I'm flexing, what I'm shooting for is to get the crown of my skull and my tailbone to kind of move together, right? So that I don't feel like my tailbone is perfectly still. And the movement may still be very, very small, but if my tailbone is coming forward, if I am getting hip flexion, I'm going to start to feel that eccentric control from my glute. And the more flexed I get, the more I'm going to feel it. And if I don't, we're going to get major over-recruitment of the QL. I actually have a particular client who has kind of debilitating low back pain when his QL turns on. And I have him do this exercise all the time, several times. In an hour-long session, I probably have him do it 20 times in between different exercises to rebuild the pattern of, as soon as you start flexing, you've got to have a glute on. And it's really best done, you know, if you do yoga, you probably see this kind of thing done with a double leg stance all the time. But the single leg stance is really more in keeping with how your glutes really function. They're you're a bipedal creature. You stabilize while you walk, and while you walk, your legs are almost never doing exactly the same thing. It's a very functional way to practice flexion. All right, let's move on to the next part here. There's kind of one more relationship that I want to draw your attention to, and this is where you start talking about the glute medius. So the glute med and then the inner thighs of the opposite side, the adductors opposite side, they have a pretty close relationship. And just like glute max, glute med could also be functionally weak or functionally inhibited for the same reasons as glute max. And when we see that, and we start seeing the QL lat dysfunction I was talking about, the other thing you're going to see opposite the side of the dysfunctional glute is over-recruitment of the adductors. And this can actually cause quite a bit of discomfort in the hip. It can create a lot of impingement and a lot of discomfort. And so there's another little stretch I like to do for people here, and we'll look at the video here on the next slide. Really super simple. Again, it's a weight shift, because these weight shifts, again, mimic how you actually use your legs, right? They're doing something different. They're opposing each other. But as I'm moving from side to side, I'm concentrating on two things. First, I'm trying to get an eccentric work out of my glute med. So I'm really pressing outward. I'm pressing laterally with my greater trochanter, trying to open up that glute med and get it turned on. And as I do that, I'm going to start to get downward motion and abduction from my opposite hip. If you go into a motion like this, thinking I'm going to stretch my inner thigh first, frequently what you end up seeing is, and can you play the video again, please, Emily?
Yep, it's playing.
Frequently what you end up seeing is increased lateral flexion in the lumbar spine. And that's not what you want, because that just gets that QL working harder, doesn't it? What you want to see is that you can load glute med first, right? It's about the adduction, the pushing outward from the greater trochanter, that loads the glute med and then tells the inner thigh, hey, it's okay, you can loosen up now. But if you don't get that activation first, you get the QL pushing to the side, creating lumbar flexion, and you may get an inner thigh stretch, but it's not a functional stretch. It's got to go along with glute med function. All right, and then here, as I promised, here's that study that I was talking about, the human gluteus maximus and its role in running, done at Harvard. Here's some of the references if you'd like to look that up. It was a really interesting study, especially if you are into comparative anatomy. It provides a lot of interesting insight as to how humans evolved a lot of the structures that they did in their hips. And it focuses on glute max, talks about some other interesting stuff too. It has a lot of very kind of useful diagrams and information if that's something that interests you. All right, folks, that's everything I've got for now. Of course, I'm open to taking some questions. There's a lot more we could talk about here, a lot more relationships we could talk about here. So anything you'd like to know, just let me know.
All right. Okay, so they weren't seeing some of the slides, unfortunately. So hopefully they still have some of the information that you were saying as far as not catching it. So if anyone has any questions, even though you weren't able to see some of the slides, as you're thinking of your questions, I know that I have a question, which is about the eccentric function of the glutes.
Yeah.
So most of the pathology that I see as a podiatrist in foot issues like shin splints, plantar fasciitis, stress fractures, etc., that's all of an eccentric dysfunction in the lower extremity, or the foot and the ankle. As far as glute dysfunction, do you see that it's more often in the eccentric phase that this dysfunction is lying as opposed to the concentric phase?
As a matter of fact, I do. I do find that, in fact, I wouldn't even say that's limited to the glute only. I would say in so many things that I end up working with on a day-to-day basis, the eccentric function seems to be the one that goes first. And it's insidious, you know, because without an eccentric controller, you can still function relatively normally for a while. And it gives you the opportunity to build really bad habits. You know, if you don't have good eccentric control from your glute, you can still walk. You're going to be walking and wearing down soft tissue and using joints improperly. You know, losing concentric function in a muscle group will often just stop you, right? You won't be able to do that thing anymore. But eccentric is kind of insidious. When you lose it, you can still function. You think you're functioning normally, but you're not, and you're wearing down soft tissue. So yeah, I do find that a lack of eccentric control does get built in really frequently, and you see it in people who suspect that nothing is wrong until something hurts. Okay,
good. That's what I was thinking. So I typically focus on eccentric programming for patients and clients, just because it's usually what's neglected. So that was an interesting thought. So we do have another question, which says, one of my clients has been complaining about his sacrum being out of place quite often. Will working the glutes cause this? Just curious. Seems like it happens after doing things like squats.
Actually, okay, that's an excellent question. So when he says seems like it happens after doing squats, squats are a good exercise, but there's some really specific cues needed to make sure that a squat goes well. Because think about what happens. Let's imagine a scenario here where we've got a person, and we'll use the right side. They've got a right side glute which is inhibited or weak, and they go into a squat. They're going to be relying much more on their quads, on their hip flexors, rectus femoris. They're going to be relying on the anterior muscles, relying on their knee extension more than their hip extension to get themselves up off the ground. So what's going to happen, what you're going to see from that person is you're going to get their left side, which is maybe doing a more balanced contraction, and then their right side is going to be heavily influenced with the anterior. So as they come up, they're going to slightly rotate, right? They're going to get, their pelvis is going to start to turn to the left. Their QL on the right side is going to overact, and they're going to get a shear. They're going to get a shearing force at the SI joint. And that's, and again, I see that same pattern all the time. So this person shouldn't, it's not necessarily that they shouldn't do squats. I mean, theoretically, I haven't seen the person, but in the context of this talk, it's not that they shouldn't be doing squats. It's that you got to cue that squat really specifically on getting the dysfunctional side to open up. And the way to spot the dysfunctional side, it's actually pretty easy. If you put him into that lunge position I had before, where that staggered stance, just rocking forward from front foot to back foot, have them do it on both legs, and whichever leg you see them doing more lumbar extension on as they go forward, that's typically the dysfunctional glute. And if you've got a good eye for this kind of thing, sometimes you can even spot the rotation in the pelvis, depending on how severe it is. But that's a pattern you can always see. And you're absolutely right. To continue doing squats, especially weight-loaded squats, where you've got the pelvis going into constant rotation, yeah, you're going to get a lot of SI pain. That would be a very uncomfortable exercise. But cueing it differently could radically change it for them.
Okay, good. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. The videos that Kevin showed, we're going to be putting on the blog and having kind of like a written summary of the great webinar that Kevin just did, because it is very technical and you kind of need to look at it a couple times for it to really sink in. But I think what you made as far as hitting home the points that we use our glutes when the opposite leg is never in like a symmetrical position, which I think is good. And I think remembering that's kind of the foundation to true functional training is just thinking of where we are using or what is the body position when we're using certain muscles. So I think you made some really great points. And Kevin's email is listed on here, kmoore, KMOORE @smarterstrength.com. And if there's any other questions, please type them in, or you can always email Kevin or myself at education@ebfafitness.com. And you can catch this and all the webinars on the EBFA website, ebfafitness.com. Click under webinar and you will find them there. And then hopefully we'll have Kevin back soon to talk about maybe the psoas.
I would love to. That'd be great.
All right. I hope you guys all have a wonderful week. Have a great night. And then Kevin, since it's morning over in Hong Kong, have a great day.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Emily.
You're very welcome. Take care, everyone.